your first fieldwork led to a PhD and a book. Can you kind of summarise briefly what the problem was and what your answer to the problem was in that first work, Caste and Kinship in Kangra?
Well, essentially what it was an attempt to kind of take off from Dumont to demonstrate the pervasiveness of the principle of hierarchy, and how hierarchical relations are not just a matter of relations between caste, but penetrate within castes, so that they kind of order the texture of human social relationships from a very micro level to within the family, to relations within and between clans and marriage circles and so forth, and how the language of hierarchy is used to describe many other forms of social relationships, including kind of landlord-tenant relationships and so on. And yet, at the same time, there is a sort of a countervailing, but in the particular case I described, ideas about equality that are rooted in notions of brotherhood, and how this social system works out. That would be one aspect of it. Perhaps the most important and interesting ethnographic bit was about marriage, and particularly about systems of unequal marriage, hypergamous marriages, and how there are internal contradictions within the system that are continually threatening it with downfall, which indeed downfall does happen. Marriage circles are reorganized into egalitarian broderies, brotherhoods, and how these in turn generate contradictions. So it's very much, as I can tell by the smile in your face, you're recognizing political systems of Burma and Gumsa and Gumlao, and it was, it was very much influenced by that, but it was also deeply influenced by reading of Lévi-Strauss's elementary structures of kinship.
Well, I was smiling because of that, but also by something which you perhaps won't like so much, which was the curious parallel between the beginning of our interview and where we've got to now. I mean, anyone watching this interview would say, well, isn't he writing about his own childhood?
Yes, which was precisely why I mentioned the hypergamous marriage at the beginning. I am conscious of that. However, it's not the problem. I mean, this has happened to me more than once in my fieldwork. I think I got interested in this problem, perhaps, though I wasn't aware of it at the time, because of my own personal background. But it certainly wasn't the case that I decided to work in Kangra because I simply was too ignorant to know that I was going to come across this kind of marriage system.
Mm. But it's the double thing. It's your own parents' hypergamous marriage and a stress you laid on class and inequality in your own family tree and background.
Yes.
Which pervaded your childhood a lot, snobbery and childhood oppositions between different social strata. I mean, England
Yes.
is very, very
I think that's exactly right. Mm. So it had some resonance with me. And perhaps that's why I wound up writing about it. But I have also to say that, I did, as I said earlier, I did a lot of work, empirical work on local level politics. Mm. And it was Andre who really discouraged me from pursuing that and writing about it. And he basically said, you just haven't got the kind of intellectual background to really write about this in a very good way. I've been influenced by Barth's game theory type of stuff, and Andre was a bit sniffy about this, and said, no, you know, the stuff you're getting on kinship and marriage is actually much more important, and you're at Cambridge, and they know about kinship and marriage at Cambridge, and you do that, you know, and maybe later on come back to the serious stuff of politics, you know.
Did you ever come back to it, or no?
No. I've sometimes had fantasies about doing so, but I think Andre was dead right. I mean, I don't think that you know, I was sufficiently well informed about the literature and what I could do with that data at that stage.
Was there ever any difficulty about having a local supervisor and having a supervisor back in England? I mean, you didn't get contrary advice between the two. I suppose you didn't hear much from Edmund.
No, I think I had one letter in the course of 2.5 years. I mean, a very friendly letter, and I'd written a little piece actually about, I did write something about politics for this Indian journal called Seminar, and I'd written a kind of report on the elections and so on. And I think one letter I had from Edmund was that I'd sent him this piece when it was published, and he wrote a nice short note saying, glad to see you're getting it in print. You know, it was the time when Edmund was becoming Provost of Kings, and I'm sure he was fully preoccupied with more important matters.
When you came back, do you remember people, students often have reverse culture shock and difficulties when they come back to England, especially after such a long time. Did you have any of those difficulties when you came back, or was it a great relief or pleasure to be back?
No, I think it was quite difficult actually. I came back and I moved back to Cambridge, and I really didn't like it at all. I mean, I very much valued my experience as an undergraduate in Cambridge and got a lot out of it, but didn't like being back in Cambridge afterwards. I think it was partly because all my friends had moved on, my kind of cohort of people I got out of sync with. Parry had spent a lot of time trying to get permission to get into the Soviet Union and do her fieldwork, so she was still doing fieldwork. Keith's fieldwork had been much shorter, so I didn't really know people terribly well, and in fact I went to live in London. And the other thing is that the period of fieldwork was over a kind of extraordinary hiatus in youth culture in Britain. I mean, 66, and I came back at the end of 1968. And, you know, kind of suddenly the world had changed, and kind of political landscape had changed very much, and it all felt quite alien. But
how was Edmund? I think you mentioned he was very helpful when you were writing up. I mean, he made a lot of comments.
Yeah.
But you didn't go to sort of writing up seminars because you were in London, or did you go to a few of those?
As I recall, there weren't writing up seminars at that stage. There was the regular Friday seminar, in which I remember I gave at least 2 papers.
That really was the writing up seminar in a way, wasn't it?
Yes, but it wasn't differentiated into a student seminar.
Yeah.
So, you know, one week there might be a graduate student, and the next week there might be Clifford Geertz. Or
Do you remember anything about those seminars? Were they lively, exciting occasions, or bloodbaths?
No, I do remember something about them. I remember them in a way more before I went to the field, in that preparatory period, as these sort of ritual jousts. But then I was attached, as I've said, as a student to the Delhi School of Economics, and somewhat to my arrogant British pride, I was sort of astounded by the fact that the Delhi School sociology seminar seemed to me to be better, more engaged, more articulate than the Cambridge seminars. I just assumed that Cambridge seminars were pretty damn good. You know? So I think after that I always looked at the Cambridge seminars with a more critical eye. And
Did you do any teaching at this stage? Were you beginning to do any supervising or anything either in London or in Cambridge while you were writing up? Or
while I was writing up, Tambaya was running the South Asia class, and he used to have a man called Roger Ballard, I think, and was it Roger? And we used to go along to all the classes, and it was a way of kind of Tambi sounding off recently returned fieldwork workers.
So you were associated with it?
Yes.
And the thesis wrote itself, or was it okay? I mean, you didn't struggle with it too much. How long did it take you to?
I think it took, I was quite slow, I think it took 2 years. And I found it agony.
Did you?
But sort of masochistically satisfying agony.
Agony because it just didn't come out right, and writing is very tiring. And
yes, writing is difficult. I had a lot of data. I just do think, I mean, maybe you're somebody who, like Alfred Gell, used to just perfectly formed, elegant sentences apparently came out. I have to struggle.
Who were your examiners?
Mar Forters and David Perko.
Were they okay?
Yes, they were absolutely fine and kind of very complimentary. I remember the Viva, during which I was rather nervous, was a slightly trying experience because Meyer sometimes used to speak in the way that he would write, long sentences with many parentheses and so on. And there were periods in the Viva, I remember, where David would intervene and say, I think what Professor Fortes means to say is...
After that, I mean, what happened? Did you get a job straight away, or?
I had a job already. In fact, I mean, I think the truth is that the only reason that I actually finished and handed in the thesis was that I'd had an interview at Edinburgh, and they had said, well, your thesis will be in by the time you start here, won't it? And I actually kind of naively took this literally and thought that it had to be. So I submitted it, I think, on the day before I went up to Edinburgh and started teaching.
When was that? About 70?
Yeah, 70, I think, at the end of 70.
How long were you at Edinburgh?
3 years.
Was that a good experience?
It was very pleasant. I liked the city of Edinburgh very much. I had a boss that I very much enjoyed. And
Little John, was it? Or?
Yeah, Jimmy Littlejohn. The department was at that stage not in very good shape. And I was actually quite glad to get out of it. Not because it was unpleasant, but because I felt that I would never actually do anything if I stayed there. And I moved to the LSE where the culture was, you do right things. And,
so you went to the LSE in 74 or something?
Yes, 74.
Describe the LSE what the LSE was like when you arrived. I mean, it was the time. Well, Morris was obviously there.
Morris was there. It was headed at the time by Julian Pitt Rivers and Johan Lewis. There was Jean LaFontaine, there was James Woodburn, Stephen Morris was still around. Jose Cotillero, I think, had just left.
Peter Loizos hadn't come.
No, Peter was there. So Peter was a kind of colleague and friend from the start. Joanna Overing joined the same year as I did.
Alfie wasn't there?
No, Alfie came later, several years later.
And Chris wasn't there?
Chris wasn't there either.
I mean, it's a difficult thing to talk about one's own department, but the LSE, I knew it just a bit before you were there,
Yes.
and a few years before, and it was even elder guard, and it was Raymond Firth and Shapiro and people like that.
Yes.
And it had already changed, but it still had Stephen Morris and James and others there. I don't know whether you want to talk about the LSE department later, because it was obviously quite, the reputation outside was that it was very riven into several factions and oppositions.
Yeah, I'm quite happy to talk about it, but I mean that's not how I actually
Perceived
kind
it.
of perceived it. I mean, I perceived it as, I feel I've been very fortunate, and I perceived it as, fair, there were intellectual tensions and some personal tensions, but, on the whole, people talked to each other. I thought it was a very engaged intellectual atmosphere. So that's not how I David McKnight was there. So, there were people who worked together more than other people. And, so I can see that, there was a degree of apparent exclusiveness, but I didn't actually experience it.
Well, you're a nice person, Johnny. no one could take exception to you, but I mean, the famous, as you know, the famous kind of tensions between Eoin and Morris.
Yes. No, that was certainly there. But when I first went, there was it was more. Morris was very junior still, and it was more, Morris being a kind of iconoclast. I mean, I remember an early staff meeting where the convener said, "This is what we're going to do," and Morris bursting out, "Conveners are just like postmen, they do what we say," something to this effect, and which no doubt deeply got up the noses of Eoin and Julian. Though Julian, I think, was altogether too patrician to really get seriously upset by it, but there was a sort of jokiness about it at that stage, anyway.
And you obviously taught a lot and supervised a lot. Do you enjoy, or do you enjoy lecturing and undergraduate supervisions and seminars?
I think what I enjoy most is undergraduate supervisions. I get quite a lot I put quite a lot into it, and I get quite a lot out of giving lectures. But I do spend a lot of time preparing them, or have done over the years. Graduate supervision and PhD students, I think that the truth is that I've actually got to enjoy it more over the years, perhaps as I felt I had more time or felt more confident or whatever. But, and I think, at the LSE, for a number of years, almost all graduate students have had two supervisors, and those who've worked in South Asia have tended to work with Chris Fuller and myself, and we've made a relatively harmonious team, and I think it's worked quite well, and particularly over more recent years.
How many PhD students have you had roughly? Do you know?
I think it's something between 35 and 40. I'm not quite sure over that.
And also presumably a number of taught masters.
Yes.
Students who did dissertation.
Yes.
And what about administration? Did you like that, or did you do much of that? Or?
Yeah, I did all the kind of routine graduate admissions and so on. I think I did 4 years altogether as the convener. which I did actually not like. And I not liked it for slightly different reasons than one often hears. I actually found my departmental colleagues were on the whole extremely supportive and nice, and that was all fine, but I just hated dealing with the LSE bureaucracy.
It used to be quite a top-down and
Yes.
intrusive bureaucracy.
The first 3 years I had as convener, we had an RE, we had a HEFKI inspection, we had some other kind of report, evaluation, and I found this really terrible, nervous strain. And as the convener, you kind of feel responsible,
When was this? In the
No,
90s?
it would have been in the 90s, yes.
Yeah.
And it was a time where departments were becoming cost centres, and you ran your own budgets and so on.
At what point did you get married? Was it when you came back from, when you
Yes.
had a job, or?
Margaret and I were living together when I was writing up my PhD thesis, and then we got married shortly after I'd taken up the Edinburgh job. She moved out to Edinburgh with me, and we got married, I think, at the Easter that year, in my first year of teaching.
She's a filmmaker.
Yes, that's right.
Tell me something about what kind of films does she make? Anthropological type films, or?
No, she's a documentary filmmaker, and I think she's made films on a number of different kinds of issues. One kind of drama documentary, and she did a series on public transport for Channel 4. I think the best way of describing it would be that they're all in some way kind of politically engaged documentary. My latest field work has been in industrial central India, and because of the stage at which the children were at that stage, I did that field work to start with alone, but like you going back every year to Nepal, I've been going back every year to this place Bilai, and Margaret set up an access training program for teaching documentary film to 12 local kids who wouldn't normally get a look in media in India. So she's developed very much an interest in that place and an independent circle of social contacts there and so on.
Well, we'll come back to Belai in a moment, but in between you, I don't know whether you went back to Kangra or whether you then, your next big fieldwork project was Benares. Was there, how did you shift, and at what point did you shift?
I shifted, I think I started the Benares fieldwork in '76.
Yeah.
I went back in, I think it was '74, very briefly to Kangra.
Yeah.
But the main purpose of that trip was to kind of suss out the possibilities of the next lot of fieldwork, which was the Benares fieldwork. And how it came about that I shifted. I mean, I've done this twice. I kind of really felt that if I went on, I'd sort of written up what I wanted to say about Kangra, and I felt, it's time to do something different. And that if I went on working in Kangra, even though if I had gone back to political interests or whatever, that somehow I would just spend the rest of my time either discovering that I was wrong or trying to justify how I was right. So I sort of made a fairly clean break and went to work in Benares.
When was that? When did you go there?
I went there first in 70s. Well, I went to look at it and kind of work out the possibilities, I think, in 74. And I started the fieldwork in 76. And I went on working in Benares. I mean, I think I had 15 months to start with, and then I kept going back till the middle of the 80s.
Can you describe what that fieldwork was about, and what was the central theme and your experience?
Benares fieldwork.
Yes.
It was a study of death, and it was a study of... Benares is a major kind of centre of a sort of death industry. People go there to die, they go there to cremate corpses, they go there to immerse the ashes of corpses cremated outside. And it was a study of the various caste groups of mortuary specialists, and so it was a study of kind of death as a living. And it was also a study of collective representations of death and of mortuary rituals. So the book that resulted was predictably called Death in Benares, but it tried to handle these two aspects. I mean, death as a social organisation and as a business enterprise, if you like, and death in its symbolic and conceptual framework.
And how was it that studying death turned you from an agnostic into an atheist?
I found the Benares fieldwork incredibly interesting and very kind of challenging. But I found a number of the ideas that I discerned as underlying a lot of what people were saying and were going on about. I mean, really rather deeply disturbing and frankly, personally unpleasant. I mean, you'd meet old men who the priests would be telling, you know, their son had died in some tragic circumstances, and the priests would be droning on about bad death and the fruits of karma and so on. And I found this personally unattractive.
I mean, Edmund was always often very angry about particularly monotheistic religions of the West and their ideas of concepts of damnation and so on and so on.
Yes.
You shared that later on, a revulsion, sense of revulsion, is that right? I mean, not shared in the sense that you took it from Edmund, but you have a similar feeling. I mean, was your dislike of all religions, or just the two main ones you'd encountered, Christianity and Hinduism?
Well, it was obviously based on the two main ones that I'd encountered, but I guess I'm, anyway, as my story of how I came to be confirmed as an Anglican would suggest, I'm religiously unmusical, so there's a certain sort of innate predisposition to skepticism. Sort of rationalist thought, if you like.
And you did quite a lot of work on the idea of gifts and debts.
Yes.
In that fieldwork, particularly, didn't you?
Yes, that's right.
What was that work about? What was the theme of that?
Well, it was sparked off by some fairly dramatic and to me extremely interesting ethnography about the remuneration of these priests, which is conceptualized as a religious gift, and it's not conceptualized as a payment. And these gifts are held to embody the sins of the donor and to do terrible things to the recipient unless they pass them on which they can't afford to because that's their living. So they're caught in this terrible double bind. So it started out with this ethnography, and this, to me, extremely interesting and rather kind of touching personal situation of these mortuary specialists, but not only mortuary specialists in Benares. I mean, these gifts are given to pilgrimage priests and so on. And that took me back to relooking at Marcel Mauss's classic essay and to more general considerations of the anthropological literature on reciprocity and so forth. And I think that I would immodestly claim that one of the spin-offs of this was a rereading of Mauss's essay that was not quite conventional at the time. It put Mauss's essay much more in terms of sort of his evolutionary thought about his thought about the evolution of society and the evolution of forms of exchange.
And it also led into, among other things, into the book you edited with Maurice Bloch on
Yes.
morality of money. And
Yes.
tell us about how that book, which has been very influential, occurred.
Well, we'd done an earlier book called Death and the Regeneration of Life. And I think actually it was me who suggested that we do a kind of repeat performance. And these were based on London University intercollegiate seminars, and each of them had about 8 or 10 essays. And I mean, I now think that their main significance probably was actually that they were sort of branding for LSE anthropology, that it brought large numbers of the contributors were either from the LSE or had been associated, and it got people, talking together and putting together their ideas on a certain theme. And I think that it gave, for a time anyway, a certain sort of profile to LSE anthropology that, was relatively significant and meant that, it was sort of it had an identifiable, and fairly coherent conception of where anthropology was going. I mean, the two, as I've said, the two books were preceded by fairly lengthy introductions that Morris and I wrote, which tried to pull the essays together and say something more general with greater or lesser success. But somewhat to my surprise, actually, I mean, the Money and Morality book was, is still around.
Yes.
People are still citing it and reading it.
My students certainly are. It's always difficult to co-edit a book with someone else, and Maurice is a lively mind. Have you always find it quite easy to work with Maurice? Or?
Yes, I haven't found it terribly difficult. I mean, there's no question of sitting in the same room and going over a draft with Morris. I mean, I need to sit down completely independently and take the text we're working on and try and write it by myself and then give it to him, and he crosses it all out. And so on. But no, I don't remember any kind of occasions where we kind of fell out or it seemed particularly difficult. I mean, I think I remember one or two occasions where he just told me that paragraph that I'd spent the last day crafting was rubbish. But I don't remember it as difficult at all.
I mean, we won't go over too many of your other colleagues, but Alphagal, I never had a chance to interview, though I've written about
Yes.
What was Alfie like as a colleague?
Alfie was, he was lovely actually. He was a wonderful seminar participant. He was just so clever, so quick, and you'd sit in a seminar, and Alfred would he would be drawing all the time, and he'd come up with kind of wonderful portraits of James Woodburn and James Woodburn's beard, great kind of tangles and so on. You think, how is this guy? He hasn't been listening to a word. And then the paper giver would end, and he would come up with some long, very incisive comment and so on. Terrific. I never worked with Alfred in the way that I've worked with, say, Morris or Chris Fuller, but I always very much enjoyed him as a colleague. He was very much a kind of lone individualist, Alfie.
Let's go on to your third piece of fieldwork, which was again very different from your second. How did that come about, and when did it come about?
Right.
Belai.
I tend not to finish things until I kind of somehow have to. I mean, it's like the
PhD.
like the PhD. So I kind of needed to commit myself to a new project. Again, like Kangra, I really wanted to kind of shift of seeing. Andre, who has been a big influence, has for years been going on at me, kind of, you really ought to take modern India more seriously. This was, of course, always one of Andre's big problems with Louis Dumont. So I was sort of sympathetic to the idea of doing something on industry. There were two very important influences on that. So this was essentially a study of steel workers in a big Soviet-built steel plant constructed on a greenfield site in central India. I wanted to do something on industry partly as a big break, partly because we had, Alfred had a PhD student, Chris Pinney, and Alfred was ill at some stage, and I was involved in Chris Pinney's supervision. And Chris Pinney had been doing a study in a company town in Madhya Pradesh, and had got sort of heavily into E.P. Thompson and so on. And Chris was an influence. I kind of felt, that's really interesting. But an equally big influence was Michael Tausig's book, The Double and Commodity Fetishism in South America, where I was just terribly intrigued by his decoding of the stories of baptism of banknotes and the devil contracts and so on, as a sort of proto-Marxian commentaries on alienation and commodity fetishism and so on. And I kind of felt that this was terribly fertile, but that Tausig's ethnography was not always of the richest and most detailed kind, and that this, opened up a whole field that I would kind of like to get into. So I decided that I wanted to do something on factory labour in India for those reasons, and I went in '92, I think, just to look around. And it was actually Alfie Jal who suggested that I might look at Belai. I went to various places, but Alfred, who'd done work in just south, Adivasi, in a tribal area to the south of there, had been through Belai. I think he'd once spent a night in a Russian hotel there or something, and he said, It looks really interesting. And I went there, and I just went there for a day, and I thought, I can only imagine making something like this. So that's how I wound up there.
And what interested you, and what was the theme of the study? Not everything at this point, or was it everything? You went with the usual open-minded.
I'm afraid, disgracefully, in a way, the answer is yes. I mean, the real question in my mind was a very kind of non-academic question. If you were somebody of my age and you'd been a peasant in one of these small villages, you would have lived through an industrial revolution in the course of your lifetime. And how would your world have changed? How would you think about those changes? What in fact would have happened to caste relations, kinship relations that was any different from the way that your parents had grown up or whatever? And that essentially is still the set of questions. I mean, it's terribly broad, but the set of questions with which I've remained. And it's gone on proliferating, because I started out and I was mainly working with workers actually in the steel plant, who are a sort of aristocracy of labour, and then I realised, well, there's the public sector factory, you know, and I think there are very big differences with people working in the private sector in all sorts of ways. So I felt I needed to, you know, do some work in private sector factories, and then I felt I needed to look at the bottom of the heap, informal sector, unorganised sector labour. So it's gone on expanding.
But it's continuing now.
It's continuing, but I feel that I've got to an age where I've got to draw it to a close, and actually I've written quite a number of articles about it. There's still other things that I want to write about in article form, but I really want to get it together as a sort of the big picture in book form now, in monograph form.
And will that be precipitated by deciding on the next project, which will force you to finish this project, or have you got another field work?
I'm afraid that my stage of life, Alan, it's precipitated more by kind of thoughts of aging. I mean, I would love to do more field work in a different kind of setting. But I think, realistically, you know, I've been going now since '93, more or less every year, and I just have incredible amounts of data about this place, and
it's time to get it all together.
Yes.
There are one or two sort of general things. We touched on religion. Politics we sort of touched on briefly. You were against the establishment person in Sherborne, but that actually does relate to this last fieldwork, because when you came and talked in Cambridge, you were talking about a particular incident of someone who had been imprisoned who was a friend of yours. Do you want to talk at all about that? Because this will go out to the world, and it's a chance to tell the world about this incident, or would you rather...
Well, I'll say something very briefly about it. This is a man called Ajay. Ajay became my research assistant in Billai. He's Malayali, he comes from Kerala, and his family had moved to Billai in the late 50s, early 60s, sort of working class people, sort of fringes of the lower middle class. And Ajay, when I met him, had been a sort of an agent for a very small company in Calcutta selling gearboxes to the steel plant, hated the job, became my research assistant, worked with Margaret, my wife, later, learning as one of the students on her, access students on her documentary film, project, got involved in the civil rights movement, documented some police atrocities, and was picked up completely cynically and put in jail for 93 days. Eventually they had to let him out without charges. I should, what more to say about this? I mean, I think I should say that very important to my ethnography has been this experience of working with research assistants, of whom Ajay was one, but still a very good friend of mine is the person who in my second year in Kangra was my research assistant in Kangra. And I've always worked with these people who have become extremely good personal friends and generally have been people with real kind of intellectual interests, but not at all well educated in formal terms, and who've been amazingly important to the ethnography that I've been able to get.
That's a nice tribute. I mean, on this last instance, certainly at one point it was considered that anthropologists shouldn't become too involved with local politics in the practical sense, or interfering in any way. They were objective describers of situations.
Yes.
Has your view shifted on that, or have you always felt that if you saw injustices you should try and do something about it?
No, I'm very ambivalent about it, and somewhat mistrust anthropology that goes over too much into social activism. Partly because, I mean, it seems to me that there is an incompatibility between the anthropologist, sociologist task and the partisanship that is required of political activism. However, when you're extremely good friends, people in whose houses you have spent many months living, on whom, in many ways the success of your project has been dependent, and who you think are thoroughly admirable people, get picked on and incarcerated in jail, and all their friends desert them. What else can you do?
Well, I've got just one more question, and then we'll see if there's anything particular I left out. And that is that you've been going repeatedly back to India over the last 30-40 years, and watched a country in which in the Bombay Stock Exchange they were wearing dhotis, and there probably wasn't a stock exchange, and there were just bullock carts on the roads. If you look at some of these early films in the 60s and 70s to what India is now. And many people comment on what is happening. What is your feelings about what is going to happen? Do you feel optimistic and enthusiastic about the dramatic transformation, or worried about how things are going?
It's interesting that we were talking, your last question was about Ajay. And I think that had you asked me that question a year ago, I would have given you perhaps a slightly different answer. But the answer that I give you now is that I feel deeply concerned about the the proportion of the Indian population that are left out of all this, and to whom basic rights of citizenship are effectively denied. Education, health, etc., etc. And for whom, democratic and for whom the democratic system and the legal apparatus basically does not work at all. So I feel a bit gloomy right at this moment, and I feel that the study that I've been doing, I think, is quite relevant to all this, because what you have is a working class in a place like Bely, part of which, or I should really say working classes, part of which, is a real aristocracy of labour that essentially has kind of been bought off or enjoys very privileged conditions, upwardly mobile, decent education, extremely good medical facilities, but basically, is not the same class as informal sector labour in terms of its sort of interests and the way it identifies itself, and basically has no interest whatever in political action on behalf of bottom of the heap construction workers and so forth. So I feel a bit kind of gloomy. This is all great for all but 1/3 of the population, but that third of the population is not doing well.
It's only a third, is it? I mean, some people would
Yes.
the ratio even worse.
Higher, yes.
Well, we've covered many things, and there are always more things in a life that one doesn't cover, but is there anything that you would have liked me to have asked you about, which I've conspicuously failed to do so?
I don't think so. I think I've said more than enough.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Johnny. That was lovely.